My panel is here now, and I want to start with you, Priscilla, and talk about some of the news, but also just this scene in the Oval Office. That Bukele is somebody who so gets Donald Trump. He obviously is, either he's very much like Donald Trump, or he is has the emotional intelligence of sort of an Einstein, because he knew exactly what to say to please him. He knew exactly the sort of triggers, if you will, whether it was DEI or trans in sports or attacking the media.
Let's take a step back in time here. When President Trump won in November, the first thing I heard from multiple sources was keep an eye on El Salvador. And this Oval Office meeting is exactly why they were saying that. This has been built up over time. Administration officials knew that El Salvador would play ball with the Trump administration, that they would be willing to do a lot for the administration when it came to his key signature issue, and that is, of course, immigration. And the president himself said there, it is his, quote, best relationship. And because of that, you can see why this gets so complicated against the backdrop of the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia and his mistaken deportation to El Salvador. You heard there from the Attorney General that it's up to El Salvador if they want to return him. Then you heard the Salvadoran president say, well, I don't have the power to do that, and doing that would be smuggling in this man. Total disregard for the opportunity for two governments to work together to rectify what court documents have shown was a wrong by the administration themselves, by the way, admitting to this wrong. It's also what the courts and the federal judges have been saying over the last several weeks, which is this lack of desire by the administration to try to retrieve this man from this notorious mega prison. Now, in addition to all of this, though, the president was saying that he's willing to send and wants to send many more migrants to this notorious mega prison. There was a moment there where they were boasting about security and who has the better security, the United States or El Salvador. The president quite keen on what's happening in El Salvador, even going so far as to say he wants more facilities there to hold migrants, including, he didn't seem to, or he seemed to suggest he'd be open to U.S. citizens being down there. All of this, by the way, Dan, as I'm also talking to my sources, has been talked about behind the scenes. Administration officials open to sending more people there, opening up more facilities there. Some of those proposals, by the way, coming from private military contractors who want to be part of this.
And I think, again, taking a step back, what you saw was a hot potato being passed in the Oval Office. Because on the one hand, you have the Attorney General before this meeting saying, well, we could send a plane down to get this Maryland man. And then you have Stephen Miller saying, well, and also the Secretary of State saying, why would we do that? He's not from here. He's from El Salvador. And then, of course, as you mentioned, the Salvadoran leader saying something completely different. And this notion that, as you kind of alluded to, Priscilla, that these two leaders can't just sit down and work it out. They obviously can't. They don't want to.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's the key point is, look, El Salvador is essentially a contractor of the United States. They are taking money to put up a prison. In principle, I actually have no real problem with that. The problem with it for them is that if it's an American facility, even by proxy, it is open to the jurisdiction of American courts. And I think that's the real reason why they don't want to return this guy. I think they don't care about the political headache of one man. The problem is if they concede the point that they can ask for him to be sent back and they send him back, that means they can ask for all of them to be sent back, which is the thing they never want to concede in court. And so they're stonewalling on this one guy so that they can proceed with this much larger project. What I don't understand about any of this is that, well, first of all, why they didn't just do the proper process? Immigration judges are Article II judges. They work for the President of the United States. There's a process at the Justice Department where they could have actually had the order rescinded. They just didn't want to do it because it wasn't manly enough or something. But secondly, is like, if you have Eric Prince doing this stuff and you're setting up American-owned or contracted out prisons in El Salvador, they are American facilities subject to American law and American courts jurisdiction. So I don't understand what problem they think they're solving there.
Stand by. I want to go to Caitlin Collins. Caitlin, you were there. You were asking some of the questions of the president and tried to ask a question of the Salvadoran leader. What were your takeaways?
I mean, essentially, they are making very clear that this Maryland man who was, by the own Justice Department's acknowledgement, mistakenly deported to El Salvador in recent weeks, that he will not be returned to the United States. That was the argument that the president was making as they were offering their own interpretation of that Supreme Court filing that said that the administration must facilitate Abrego Garcia's return to the United States. And they were essentially arguing that that was not the case, that then the courts would be trying to intervene in foreign policy, which is strictly in the purview of the President of the United States. And Stephen Miller, who of course is one of the president's top advisors, was there standing next to me inside the Oval Office and was saying that that is essentially a question that is better positioned to the president of El Salvador. I then asked President Bukele his interpretation of that, and he essentially likened it to smuggling a terrorist back into the United States if he returned this man who was mistakenly deported to his country and is still being held there based on a filing that we saw over this weekend. And so he was essentially scoffing at the idea of returning him. And so I think one thing coming out of that was clear, as we're in the middle of this huge court fight between this man's attorneys and the White House and the Justice Department on this, is that they do not plan to ask the president of El Salvador to return this man or to help facilitate his return as he's being held in that notorious mega prison in El Salvador. And so you heard the administration's argument. Obviously, that is something that is going to come up in court filings coming out of this, because they have said by their own acknowledgement that it was an administrative error that he was deported to El Salvador after being granted protection in 2019 here in the United States by an immigration judge, essentially saying out of fear of persecution that he could not be sent back to El Salvador. And so certainly a hardline stance that we just saw coming out of the Oval Office on this, which is notable, Dana, because just a few days ago on Air Force One, after that Supreme Court ruling came out that had some confusion in it in terms of, essentially giving the White House a deadline to have this man returned, the president said if the Supreme Court said that someone had to be returned, that he would abide by that ruling. And so I asked him about that just now during that back and forth inside the Oval Office. And clearly their position on this has changed, which Stephen Miller has been articulating and saying that they do not plan to return this man.
Yeah, that was the question after listening to all of that I had. And of course, you asked it, Caitlin, about the Supreme Court, because we were planning on running that clip from the president saying explicitly that he has respect for the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says they have to get him back, that they would. And the fact that he deflected in his answer to you, I'll just describe it that way, I thought was very noteworthy.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Dana, can I also say, as I was listening to after they said it was a question for the president of El Salvador, I asked him outright, did he plan to help facilitate his return? Obviously, he could easily do so. President Trump was sitting next to him, and I don't know if you could see this on the camera, but he was essentially beaming as he was listening to one of his closest allies, obviously the first leader of Latin America to visit the White House, which is a statement in and of itself, as he was making that argument that no, they would not return him. He called it, the quote was preposterous on this notion of returning the Maryland man that they say was wrongly deported to his country.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you so much, Caitlin. Thanks for jumping out to the North Lawn to come on with us. Appreciate it. Tia, I do want to bring in some of what we have been talking about and specifically talk about this notion of U.S. citizens potentially being sent there. Jonah said, well, maybe if El Salvador is effectively a contractor, or we contract El Salvador to be the place where we send prisoners, maybe that is a thing that's going to happen. I just want our viewers to listen again to what the president said on this topic.
I'd like to go a step further. I mean, I said it to Pam. I don't know what the laws are. We always have to obey the laws, but we also have homegrown criminals that push people into subways, that hit elderly ladies on the back of the head with a baseball bat when they're not looking, that are absolute monsters. I'd like to include them in the group of people to get them out of the country.
Yeah, I think it's, again, it's very troubling, not just because the unprecedented, change in policy of putting U.S. citizen prisoners and potentially putting them outside of the country for whatever sentencing or even awaiting sentencing, because again, these flights to El Salvador, yes, there are undocumented immigrants, but most of them have not been accused of wrongdoing outright. There's been no evidence to really justify their deportations. So what happens if that lack of due process begins to trickle down to U.S. citizens as well. What happens when a U.S. citizen perhaps is detained, but then as the case unfolds, there is justification to say, hey, maybe they were wrongfully arrested. And then what if the government says, well, they're already there, we can't do anything about it? So it leads to a lot of questions. And again, because what we've seen already with undocumented immigrants, I just think it could lead to a really dark place.